Hi, my name is Andrew Farmer from Mirus, Australia. In this video we're going to talk about the Australian National Aged Care Classification System, or AN-ACC. It's the primary funding mechanism for residential aged care in Australia. In this video we're going to cover four key topics. First, an introduction to AN-ACC, what is it? Next, the external funding assessment process. Then we're going to look at care minutes and how AN-ACC funding is linked to it. And finally, how AN-ACC affects various roles in the organisation. So firstly, an introduction to AN-ACC. The Australian National Aged Care Classification System, or AN-ACC as it's commonly called, is the primary funding model for residential aged care. This funding represents 80% of the income of residential aged care operation. That is a very significant percentage, so obviously gaining an understanding of AN-ACC and the way that it affects different roles in the organisation is very important. The AN-ACC system was introduced on the 1st of October 2022, and it replaced the previous Aged Care Funding Instrument, or ACFI, which had been in place for over a decade. The most significant differences between the two funding mechanisms is that ACFI was much more focused on specific procedures. If you do a certain thing, you get funded a certain amount. The AN-ACC tool uses a case mix model, where there are different weightings associated with different levels of care, and these weightings, multiplied by a price, determines the funding for each resident. The AN-ACC system was put in place in October 2022 following a Royal Commission into aged care that had a series of recommendations, many of which were adopted by the government. One of these recommendations was to improve the way that aged care was funded and align it better with different levels of care. AN-ACC as a model has three different components. The first component is a one-off payment that is made when a resident enters a new organisation. The second component is a set amount that is called a base care tariff, and it relates to the type of facility and applies equally to all residents in that facility. The majority of facilities will fall under a single base care tariff called All Other RACFs. There are a small number of higher tariffs for very remote facilities and those that cater for specialised groups. These groups include Indigenous or homeless residents. The third component is a variable component, and it's based on the assessed care needs of the resident by an external assessment process. The resident is assessed against a number of criteria including mobility, cognition and compounding factors, and from that they receive one of 13 classifications. Class 1 is a palliative on entry classification, and it's the only class that can be assigned to a resident before they enter the facility. This is one of the highest levels of funding under AN-ACC. All other assessments must be done after the resident has entered the facility. So Class 2 is the lowest level of funding, all the way up to Class 13, which is the highest and equal to Class 1. The externally assessed component will depend heavily on the level of mobility of the resident, and it's the first assessment done by the assessor. There are three levels of mobility under AN-ACC. You can be independently mobile, you can be assisted in your mobility, or you can be not mobile. After mobility, several other related assessments will be done depending on your level of mobility, for example, pressure sore risk, if the resident is not mobile. The AN-ACC model is a case mix based funding model, which means that the base care tariff and variable components have a weighting attached to them. These weightings are then added together and multiplied by the AN-ACC price. The AN-ACC price is set by the Department of Health with advice from an independent pricing authority. This works in a very similar way to the case mix model used in the hospital system. One of the new aspects of the AN-ACC funding model is that the assessments are completed by an external workforce. The previous ACFI model was a self-assessed model that required external validation. Now, every resident that comes into a facility requires an assessment after they have arrived. The only classification they can have before they arrive is palliative on entry, Class 1. While a resident is waiting for an assessment to be done, they will receive a default rate for every day that they are in the facility and not assessed. When the assessment is completed, their payment rate will be backdated to their date of entry. The external assessments are completed by Independent Assessment Management Organisations, or AMOs. This is an external workforce. It's external to the Department of Health, it's external to the provider. Once you have notified Medicare of the entry of the resident to your organisation, the AMOs will automatically be sent to your facility to assess the new resident. The external assessors will run the assessment process and will typically do four key things. First, they will speak to and assess the resident directly. Then they will speak to the family if required, they will speak to the staff if required, and they will review the clinical documentation that is available. Using these four key inputs, the assessors will use a new AN-ACC algorithm to determine the classification. The information captured during the process will not be shared, but the classification for each resident will be published after a few days on the My Aged Care portal. There is a default classification designated as 99, which will be applied until the external assessment process can be completed. The responsibility of the organisation is to make all of the information available to the assessors, but also there is an opportunity for the organisation to be prepared. There is an opportunity to understand the assessment process and to be able to predict the potential classification outcome, so that you can make sure that the best possible information is available to achieve an accurate classification. If you do not agree with the classification that has been determined, an appeal can be made and a different independent assessor will be sent to repeat the assessment. If the two results are the same, the assessment will stand. If they are different, the matter will be investigated further. When a resident comes into your organisation for respite, there are also a number of AN-ACC classes for this. The classes are now low, medium and high, and are mostly based on the mobility of the resident. They are designated classes 101, 102 and 103. So all of the possible classifications you might see for a resident are 99 default, 101, 102 and 103 for respite, class 1 for palliative on entry, and then class 2 through to class 13. You can see the resident classifications in the My Aged Care portal or any system that is connected via Proda to Services Australia, like your finance system, your funding system, or maybe your clinical system. One of the most significant changes with the introduction of AN-ACC was the linking of funding with the provision of minimum care minutes. This is a very significant change for the industry. What this means is that for every level of funding that is determined for a resident under AN-ACC, there is also a care minute requirement that is associated with that funding level. This is calculated using a relative value unit, or RVU. When the variable component of AN-ACC funding is determined, there is also a variable component of care minutes associated with that classification. This care minute weighting percentage is given for each classification, including the respite classes 101, 102 and 103. There is no care minute allocation for the default class of 99. Rather than multiplying this weighting by the price as it is for funding, this specific care minute weighting is multiplied by the industry average care minute target. This calculation is done for each resident, but this is not a target you need to meet for an individual resident. It's the contribution that each resident will make to the overall target for the facility. So the total target at the facility level will be the sum of all the individual targets for the residents, and the total care minutes divided by the number of residents will give you the minimum average care minute requirement that should be met for that facility. The department will monitor the classifications and the bed days for all of the residents in a facility over a quarter and determine over that time what is the average target that will be set for the next quarter. That facility will then be required to meet that target through their rosters as a minimum over the next quarter. The mechanism for reporting on this is the Quarterly Financial Report, or QFR. At the end of every quarter, every facility of every organisation will need to report the number of care minutes they have delivered. Care minutes are reported for direct care only at 3 levels: RN minutes, EN minutes, which each have a specific registration, and then the rest of the minutes are reported as care worker minutes. Care minutes compliance is mandatory from October 2023. Care minutes are also included as part of the star rating for each facility. The star ratings have been created so that consumers can compare facilities with each other across 4 performance measures: care minutes, consumer experience interviews, the quality indicators, and the quality record of the facility. So how will AN-ACC affect the roles in the organisation? Let's first of all look at admissions. For every resident that comes in, AN-ACC will need to be determined for that resident. This is not just because we might want to know the funding level, but because that funding level will determine a care minute requirement, which may change the average care minutes for that facility. So there will be a direct connection between an admission and the rosters. Any new admission may increase or decrease the overall care minute requirement for the facility, and therefore the roster required to deliver those care minutes. At the same time, there may be a number of residents whose care needs may be changing. These residents may require review or reclassification of their funding level. These reclassification requests are made to the external assessors, and this is usually managed by the funding team in an organisation. These requests can basically happen at any time that care needs change for a resident, but we need to be careful. Any change in funding classification will also change the minimum care minutes that are contributed by that resident to the total care minute requirement. So now the admissions staff, the funding staff, and the rostering staff all need to be aware of the impacts of their decisions on each other. Most organisations would like to keep their rosters fairly stable. So managing this information flow in a timely manner is also important to keeping the balance of the rosters. The finance team and management team are required to provide some oversight to this decision-making process, as it will directly affect the performance of the business. The largest part of income and cost are being affected, which are the two biggest drivers of financial sustainability for the facility. AN-ACC will also directly affect most of the clinical staff. What's most important about the way that AN-ACC operates is that external assessors are reviewing the residents for a small window of time. Then they are relying quite heavily on the staff and the documentation to fill in any information gaps for the care needs of that resident. This is particularly important for care requirements such as behaviours and mobility, which may vary significantly from time to time. It's important for all clinical staff to know that external assessors will be coming in and out of the facility, and that the information they provide and record in the clinical documentation will have a direct impact on the funding and compliance of AN-ACC. AN-ACC therefore affects many of the staff in the organisation, and they all need to understand how their roles are contributing to the success of the funding model in residential aged care. So that's a brief introduction to AN-ACC in residential aged care. I hope that this clarifies how important the success and understanding of AN-ACC is to the financial sustainability of residential aged care operators, and how this in turn can support improved care outcomes for our residents. My name is Andrew Farmer from Mirus Australia. Thank you for listening.